Welcome to the Exploress. Time traveling through history, one era at a time. I'm Kate Armstrong. When Henry VIII shuffled off this mortal coil in 1547, a period of dangerous instability rocked England. Henry's 9-year-old successor, Edward, reigned for just 6 years before passing away from illness. Henry's eldest daughter, Mary, reigned for 5 years before she died as well. After all of that baby mama succession drama, Henry had 2 children take their shot at ruling England, but just 11 years after his death, his very large seat was still vacant. Enter Elizabeth I, the once illegitimate daughter of his second wife, Anne Boleyn. At the ripe young age of 25, she would take the throne and stay there for a staggering 45 years, ushering in a period now referred to as England's Golden or Elizabethan Age. You know, when you have a whole historical period named in your honor, you must be doing something right. She lorded over the era of Shakespeare, increased colonization and exploration, you know, for good and ill, and England's Renaissance. But it was also an era of inflation, Catholic rebellion, and war with Spain. Queen Elizabeth I reigned over it all, guiding the country with a regal and unwavering hand. And in time, she became one of England's most beloved monarchs. Her enemies feared her, and her subjects generally adored her, lavishing praise on their virgin queen, good Queen Bess, Gloriana, the most powerful woman of her time, in an age when women were still considered property, owning the halls of Westminster. Take a knee, boys. Welcome to the Age of Elizabeth. This queen regnant's life is long and full, and could easily be its own season. But instead of covering the whole of her life and rule, we're going to get her 6 top tips for queenship, the secrets that made her one of England's most infamous and long-lasting rulers. So, grab your favorite scepter and strap on your most elaborate ruff. Let's go traveling. But first, a shout out to some of my patrons. My newest pirate queens, Ellen, Jennifer, Tracy, Megan, and Jessica. My boss ladies, Luna, Melissa, Amy, Anne, Annabelle, Celia, Dawn, Elizabeth, Grace, Jessica, Sophie, and Julian, Michelle, Monique, Natalie, Nuria, Patricia, Rebecca, Sarah, and Tanya. My warrior queens, Carmen, Alexis, Amanda, Kate, Ika, Samantha, Anna, Carlos, Deborah, Heike, Iris, Kat, the 2 Jessicas, Kelly, Sana Nasuno, Stephanie, and Terry. My Imperial Empresses, Bridget, Faye and Whimsy Soapworks, and Katie. And my Lady Pharaohs, the wonderful Laura and the fabulous Courtneys. Patrons' contributions play a huge role in keeping the Exploress going. This season, they allowed me to hire my research and writing assistant, Carly Quinn, without whom these episodes wouldn't have been possible. Patrons also get access to exclusive bonus episodes, early access to regular episodes, the yearly Exploress calendar, which just dropped recently, Exploress merch, full interviews with my guests, and more. To find out all about it, just go to my website.
Rule number 1. Do not put a ring on it.
From her first day as queen, Elizabeth faced an uphill battle for legitimacy because she was an unmarried woman. Most people didn't think a woman could handle being queen all on her lonesome, which makes sense given all we've learned this season about the Tudors' understanding of men and women's roles. A woman's natural state was that of submission and obedience, so how could she ever be expected to rule over an entire country? Many people viewed it as unnatural, even monstrous, and just plain wrong, including a guy you definitely didn't want to get stuck sitting next to at a dinner party. Mr. John Knox, the proud author of The First Blast of the Trumpet Against the Monstrous Regiment of Women. He described female rule as blasphemous, writing,
"So both by God's law and the interpretation of the Holy Ghost, women are utterly forbidden to occupy the place of God in the offices foresaid, which he has assigned to man."
He went on to argue that the weaknesses of women left them incapable of wielding authority.
To promote a woman to bear rule, superiority, dominion, or empire above any realm, nation, or city is repugnant to nature. It is the subversion of good order, of all equity and justice.
Tell us how you really feel, John. Elizabeth wasn't the first woman to blaze this regal trail in England. When her half-sister Mary reigned before her, Parliament passed an act to reassure the country that a queen regnant had the same power and authority as a king. The act made it clear that a woman could rule in her own right, and that
the regality and dignity of the king or of the crown, the same was the queen.
Some men even defended her ability to rule, although their arguments in her favor left something to be desired. John Aylmer, a well-known bishop and scholar, supported Elizabeth by saying that while he accepted Knox's view that women were less competent, this didn't necessarily mean that they were incompetent. Thanks, John. A far more persuasive argument was put forth by poet Edward Dyer, who wrote that Elizabeth must be competent because she had been chosen by God to rule.
"When God chooseth himself by sending to a king, whose succession is ruled by inheritance and lineal descent, no heirs male, it is a plain argument that for some secret purpose he mindeth the female should reign and govern."
Indeed, Elizabeth herself would often make use of Dyer's argument in the years to come. And whenever a man decided to complain about her choice to rule while remaining single, she'd simply remind them that she had been handpicked by the most important man of all, Almighty God. But Elizabeth still had to deal with constant attempts to get her married. The English people were pretty desperate to find a husband for their queen. Given what we've learned about the Tudor person's fear of single ladies, this is unsurprising. But their anxiety about Elizabeth's single status, in particular, was driven by a lot of factors. Let's discuss the top tier 3. First, because royal marriages were a good way to forge political alliances. Foreign husbands might not be good for much, but they could be good for shoring up England's national security. Kings married for military support too, you know. And then there was the issue of succession, something Elizabeth's father spent much of his reign avidly obsessing over. Elizabeth was responsible for providing an heir and continuing the Tudor line of succession, preferably, of course, with a son. Elizabeth's people were tolerating a woman on the throne, for now, but they were clearly hoping it wouldn't last forever. So were the many men around her. The government, in particular, found it degrading to have to serve a woman. Our favorite royal pain in the rear end, John Knox, summed up the issue in this way.
"Woman in her greatest perfection was made to serve and obey man."
They were meant to be submissive and obedient, and the queen upset that natural order. Besides, how could Lizzie's feeble brain and wandering uterus possibly be expected to handle commanding a military all on her own? They thought that nobody would fear her, and that England would become a laughingstock. Her chief advisor, William Cecil, seems to have lost a great deal of sleep trying to convince his queen to get hitched.
"I am most sorry of all that Her Majesty is not disposed seriously to marriage, for I see likelihood of great evil if she shall not shortly marry."
In 1559, the House of Commons went so far as to petition Elizabeth about it, begging her to marry. The petition read,
"Nothing can be more repugnant to the common good than to see a princess, who by marriage may preserve the commonwealth in peace, to lead a single life, like a vestal nun."
Gents, I'm not sure if you've listened to the Exploress before, but ancient Rome's Vestal Virgins were some of the most powerful people up in that place, so I'm not really sure you're making your point. Despite the constant pressure, Elizabeth refused to marry. She insisted from a very young age, even before becoming monarch, that she had no interest in hitching her wagon to a man. She told one ambassador,
"I would rather be a beggar and single than a queen and married."
When speaking to the French ambassador, she said,
"When I think of marriage, it is as though my heart were being dragged out of my vitals."
Life for most single women in Tudor England could be really hard. Society distrusted a single lady. In many ways, it would have been easier for Elizabeth to marry. So why did she insist on digging her heels in? Her subjects certainly had a few ideas. Naturally, they speculated about her having a physical deformity or health problems that prevented her from wanting to marry and have children. Cardinal William suspected it was because Elizabeth was super horny and couldn't
confine herself to one man.
Okay, William. It's hard to pin down her exact feelings on the subject because she was so good at hiding them to suit her own agenda. But we can assume her tumultuous upbringing and her mom's fate didn't warm her to the prospect. Elizabeth didn't grow up with healthy examples of the matrimonial state, and she probably found the idea psychologically traumatizing. Her father beheaded her mother, Anne Boleyn, for starters, and Elizabeth was around 7 when he cast off Anne of Cleves. She then watched him execute his 5th wife, Catherine Howard. Her stepmother, Catherine Parr, died from childbirth complications shortly after marrying Thomas Seymour. You know, a man who began sexually assaulting Elizabeth when he moved in with them. Robert Dudley would recall that at just 8 years old, Elizabeth would tell him that she'd never marry. Given her childhood, it isn't hard to see why. Another, simpler explanation is that she couldn't marry the man she truly loved, her longtime favorite, Robert Dudley, and so she decided not to marry at all. Robert and Lizzie were childhood friends, and when Elizabeth became queen, she made him Master of the Horse and Privy Councillor. Although Elizabeth called Robert her bonny sweet Robin and told an ambassador,
"I cannot do without my Lord Robert."
Robert was deeply unpopular with the people, the son of an executed traitor, and his first wife died under pretty mysterious circumstances, found dead at the bottom of a staircase. Some people thought Robert murdered her to clear the way to marry his queen. Robert was eventually exonerated, but Elizabeth knew she could never marry him without causing an enormous scandal. Nonetheless, the two remained close, and he tried for years to convince Elizabeth to marry him. But she was well aware of what people thought of her relationship with Robert, and on her deathbed, she admitted that,
though she loved him dearly, nothing unseemly had ever passed between them.
It's a nice romantic notion for her marital choices, but it probably wasn't the driving force behind her staying single. In Elizabeth's eyes, Parliament's attempts to force her into wife and motherhood was a threat to her very sovereignty. She didn't want to share power or be controlled by a husband. One episode with her favorite, Robert Dudley, is particularly telling. When he tried to discipline one of her servants, Elizabeth angrily shot back at him.
"If you think to rule here, I will take a course to see you forthcoming. I will have here but one mistress, and no master."
Elizabeth viewed herself as exceptional. She had the education, ambition, and intelligence to rule her country by herself. She relished the freedom, power, and control the office of monarch afforded her, and thus refused to give it up, even though producing heirs was considered the most basic function of queenship. Even the constant Catholic death threats and assassination plots could not convince her to give up her independence. Catherine de' Medici, another pretty strong lady, remarked to one of Elizabeth's counselors, "Doth not your mistress see that she shall be always in danger until she marry?" One could argue that she would be in danger if she did. Look at her sister Mary, who ended up marrying Philip II of Spain. She thought he would make a great political match, but most of her cabinet opposed it. He was too Catholic, they said. Along with Mary's fervent Catholicism, they feared it would be seen as a threat to the Protestant faith. Thus, there was fear and rebellion against the marriage, and that caused a lot of drama for Mary. Elizabeth watched the strain that fighting for Philip with her counselors put on her sister, as well as the upset of several phantom pregnancies. I can only imagine her thinking, no thank you. Mary ruled jointly with her husband, even though he wasn't technically a Tudor. While Henry's wives were expected not to presume a role in the running of the country, a husband in this era just might. One of the bedrocks of a Tudor marriage, as we know, is that a wife is expected to obey her husband. Without doubt, that might have undermined some of her authority. As the diplomat from Scotland, Sir James Melville, surmised,
"I know the truth of that, madam. You need not tell it to me. Your Majesty thinks if you were married, you would be but Queen of England, and now you are both King and Queen."
She also feared that producing or even naming an heir would undermine her power and perhaps inspire her enemies to try to get rid of her. As she told the House of Commons as early as 1559,
"Assuredly, if my successor were known to the world, I would never esteem my state to be safe."
Elizabeth knew the only way to stay in control of her sovereignty was to keep herself single, which she sold to the people by leaning into it. Early on in her reign, she proclaimed that the reason she wouldn't marry was because she was
"already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England."
That's some good PR and a pretty savvy power move. It meant the crown lay very firmly with her.
Rule number 2. Keep your suitors waiting.
In Elizabeth's time, all monarchs were pressured into marriage negotiations for the sake of heirs and foreign alliances, and Elizabeth had a number of suitors vying for her hand, despite declaring in her first speech before Parliament that her tombstone would read that she had lived and died a virgin. Elizabeth wasn't always the virgin queen we now view her as. Her cult of virginity was only developed decades after she took the throne, once she became too old to bear children. In her earlier years, Lizzie fashioned herself as an eligible bachelorette willing to marry a foreign husband. No one was seriously considering that their young, pretty queen would remain permanently single. She was quite a catch, after all. Because everyone assumed she would marry, Elizabeth's portraits were dutifully sent to potential suitors. And though we know Elizabeth wasn't personally very inclined toward wedlock, she actually encouraged marriage negotiations. Why? Well, for one, Lizzie loved being courted. There is a kind of power in having suitors on the hook, always waiting. The Spanish ambassador, de Silva, remarked,
"I do not think anything is more enjoyable to this queen than the treating of marriage, although she assures me herself that nothing annoys her more. She is vain and would like all the world to be running after her."
So who were these men running after Elizabeth? First up was Philip of Spain. Yep, that Philip of Spain, Mary's husband, who did not mourn her for very long before chasing after her half-sister. Other candidates followed, including the younger sons of France, the sons of the Holy Roman Emperor, and Prince Eric of Sweden, who wrote Elizabeth love letters and challenged people to duels on her behalf, as you do. He later went insane and executed so many people that his subjects eventually poisoned him, so Elizabeth may have dodged a bullet there. But still, Elizabeth knew what she was doing. She was a master at playing the long game. It was good politics to tentatively agree to a marriage before eventually changing her mind when it suited her. It helped her avoid offending her allies. Take one of her more serious suitors, Charles II, the Archduke of Austria. Elizabeth was seriously considering accepting his hand, it said, but there were two big obstacles that prevented her from saying yes. First, Charles was Catholic, and Lizzie would only marry somebody who practiced the same religion as her. And secondly,
"The queen says that she has taken a vow to marry no man whom she has not seen, and said she would rather be a nun than marry without knowing whom and on the faith of portrait painters."
Elizabeth had apparently learned from her father's mistakes and flat out refused to sign the marriage contract without first meeting Charles in person. Or was this a stalling tactic? Charles felt that he would lose his dignity were he to come to England before a formal betrothal, and eventually the negotiations fell through. The final contender for Elizabeth's hand arrived late in the game. Elizabeth was in her 40s and was once again under immense pressure to marry and have a child, both due to her age and a series of dangerous assassination plots. The man in question? Francis, Duke of Anjou, the brother of the King of France. The idea of a French alliance was attractive, to be sure, to shore up England's defenses against a hostile Spain. But Francis also had personal merits. Elizabeth was 46 years old, and Francis was 24, and he alone, out of all of Elizabeth's suitors, made the trip to England to meet her in person. Lizzie was delighted with Francis, but nobody else was. Robert Dudley was so jealous that he accused Francis of using amorous potions and unlawful arts to seduce Elizabeth. Some members of Parliament didn't take to Francis due to his Catholicism, while others didn't like him due to his general Frenchness. Certainly, neither of them helped. Then, John Stubbs wrote a pamphlet warning that, because men always dominated women in marriage, if she married,
our dear Queen Elizabeth, I shake to speak it, would be led blindfold as a poor lamb to the slaughter.
At this point, John had printed one too many pamphlets for Elizabeth's liking, so she put him on trial, and he ended up losing his right hand over it. Dang, Elizabeth. Eventually, Parliament took a vote, Francis was shot down, and marriage negotiations ceased. Elizabeth was upset and publicly wept about it. But, it was said,
in her own chamber she danced for very joy at getting rid of him.
It was at this point, around the 1580s, that many people began begging Elizabeth not to marry. They, too, had realized that Elizabeth's age was going to make childbirth dangerous, and Lizzie was doing a pretty good job of ruling England on her own. A foreign, especially Catholic husband might ruin everything. Suddenly, a virgin queen didn't seem so bad after all. Was this all part of Elizabeth's grand design? Keep him on the hook just long enough to secure your own power? It's hard to say for sure, but Elizabeth seized her chance and embraced the ideal of womanly chastity. She rebranded herself as the Virgin Queen, mother of her people. Whereas she used to flaunt her virginity as a way to seem like an eligible bride, she now used it to remain single, independent, and powerful. What was once a weakness was now celebrated as a strength. By leaning into this idea that virginity was the only acceptable alternative to marriage, Elizabeth exploited patriarchal societal views to get exactly what she wanted. Elizabeth's chastity also proved that she was morally worthy of holding the crown, and her pure reputation extended to her political motivations too. Her governing acts were as pure as her body. Similarly, she took on the void left by the suppressed Virgin Mary and wrapped herself in the forgotten symbolism of the discarded Catholic idol. Protestants came to love Elizabeth as much as Catholics had once loved the Virgin Mary. This was some very excellent myth-making, and it's a big part of what kept Elizabeth in power for so long.
Rule number 3. Dress for the job you want.
All Tudors knew the vital importance of public image when it came to holding on to the crown. Henry VIII was incredibly good at using fashion to underscore his divine right to kingship. But if Elizabeth ever went up against him in a sartorial tennis tourney, it would be game, set, and match. Bye, Henry! Elizabeth truly mastered the art of self-representation and presentation. Using fashion, portraiture, spectacle, and public events, she was able to legitimize her rule and shape a very specific image. That of beloved Mother of England, ageless goddess, and, of course, their Virgin Queen. As we discussed in our episode on Anne Boleyn and fashion, Elizabeth often used clothing as a way to express herself. Makeup, jewelry, and dresses were all tools through which she was able to cultivate a larger-than-life persona. She kept her red hair down to symbolize her unmarried status, wore plenty of black, white, and pearls to symbolize her virginity, and chose intricately embroidered clothing with enormous ruffs to demonstrate her grandeur and wealth. She wore daring doublets and other masculine styles that made her look equal to any king in the public's eyes. Her elaborate dress was meant to remind people that she was no mere mortal. She was a deity in human form. The fact that her massive drum farthingales and stiff ruffs forced people to move out of her way or risk getting trampled, quite literally, can't have hurt the force of her presence. Playing goddess did have a downside, though. Beauty was considered a blessing from God, so as God's chosen ruler, Elizabeth always had to appear beautiful. It was a sign that she had the right to rule. Thus, as she got older, she became obsessed with using makeup to cover her wrinkles and smallpox scars, and she often used over-the-top clothing and jewelry to distract people from her decaying teeth, which came courtesy of her deep love of sugar. If a king or queen appeared weak or old in their portraits, it would reflect poorly on the entire country, and so Elizabeth took her portraits incredibly seriously. In fact, she issued proclamations concerning the production of her image, essentially making it illegal to visually represent her in any way that made her look ugly, and her government set about burning images that she didn't approve of. Elizabeth also went on the offensive, commissioning elaborate portraits of herself styled exactly as she chose. Portraits were an excellent method of propaganda, and in an era without photography or video, it was critical that Elizabeth always be recognizable. She wanted her subjects to feel as though they knew her, which is why Elizabeth always looks the same in her portraits, regardless of if they were painted when she was 30 or 50. She never shows any signs of aging, and that was very purposeful. Consistency, she knew, was comforting in a monarch. That's why Elizabeth's motto was always the same. She knew that appearing ageless would reassure her subjects, who were getting increasingly worried about the fact that she had no heirs and hadn't named one. She actively tried to promote the idea that she would never die, and that her advanced age wasn't affecting her ability to rule. She recognized that, as queen, the physical embodiment of England, her body could not appear to be changing or aging. Thus, her portraits all have a sense that she is a fierce, immortal being that, like England, will never wither.
Rule number 4. When people talk badly about you, you could ignore them. But personally, I would rather pass legislation that makes slandering the Queen illegal and build one of the best spy rings in the world.
No matter how excellent a monarch she was being, Lizzie could not overcome her gender or her lack of an heir, and the English people dealt with their many anxieties about her life choices by talking smack. Elizabeth was well aware of what people were saying about her, and in 1564 she told the Spanish ambassador, Guzman de Silva,
"My life is in the open, and I have so many witnesses that I cannot understand how so bad a judgment can have been formed of me."
Elizabeth also knew how important reputation was for a woman of her era, and as a woman in power, she was a veritable lightning rod for slander. She was the most powerful person in England, and yet she couldn't stop people from talking about her sex life. She was often called a whore and accused of being unfit to rule because of her so-called loose morals. A little rich, given her dad's behavior with his, wait, let me count, 6 wives, most of whom he started sleeping with before he had divorced his previous one. Ah, sweet double standard, alive and always thriving. Nonetheless, Catholic Cardinal William Allen told anyone who would listen that Elizabeth
shamefully defiled her person and country, and made her court as a trap by this damnable and detestable art to entangle in sin.
And Sir Nicholas Throckmorton, the English ambassador, wrote from Paris that the French gossip about Elizabeth's sexuality made him wish he were dead.
One laugheth at us, another threateneth, another revileth the queen.
This pattern of reducing Elizabeth to her sexuality was less about her actual behavior, though, and more about attacking her politics. There's no better way in the Tudor period to undermine a woman's authority than to call her chastity into question. But at least Elizabeth could do something about it, and she did. In 1559, she made it treasonous to maliciously, advisedly, and directly say that the Queen's Majesty that now is, during her life, is not or ought not to be Queen of this realm. One woman was actually jailed for spreading the rumor that Elizabeth had gotten pregnant by her favorite, Robert Dudley. But it wasn't just verbal attacks Elizabeth had to worry about. Many of the threats made against her were very physical indeed. There were many attacks on Elizabeth's life over the years, especially from her Catholic haters. There were many Catholics, both within her country and in the many nations around her, who didn't think she had a right to the royal seat she was posing on. And so there were many attempts on her life, some half-baked, others quite elaborate. And so Elizabeth did what any smart monarch would. She built one of the world's most infamous secret services, and the UK's first official spy network. Her Watchers, led and ruthlessly organized by Francis Walsingham, cracked codes, intercepted letters, and sniffed out dissenters, all while keeping a low and secret profile. There wasn't an official exam to become one of Elizabeth's secret spies, which meant that while some were excellent, some were truly bad at it. And they tended to get paid depending on their results, which meant that some of them concocted pretty wild tales of their adventures. But there's no doubt that they were, in general, incredibly effective. Elizabeth was close with several of the men who helped keep her safe. John Dee, alchemist, magician, and astrologer to the Queen, also did a lot of spying for her with the Spanish. He signed his letters to the Queen with the insignia 007. Yes, the original 007. The one that Ian Fleming borrowed when he started creating James Bond. Of course, her spies couldn't keep every threat from slipping through, so Elizabeth learned to be on her guard always. Royals of Elizabeth's time were, as a rule, pretty paranoid about being poisoned. Henry VIII had food and wine tasters there to sample things before he did, just in case there was poison in it. He also had napkin fondlers and tablecloth kissers. One can never be too careful. Elizabeth's counselors were very wary of her receiving gifts of anything that might touch her body. In 1560, her Secretary of State, William Cecil, got so concerned about a Catholic plot that he not only had her food tested, but also her clothes. The royal underwear and all manner of things that shall touch any part of Her Majesty's body bare had to be both guarded and tested. He certainly had reason to be nervous. In 1587, a French ambassador plotted to poison her in just this way. In 1597, another guy smeared a poisonous substance on Elizabeth's horse's saddle, but she was wearing so many layers that it didn't take. It's no surprise, then, to learn that Elizabeth was very fond of the many tokens said to help protect against poison. For example, her 7-foot-long unicorn horn, which was actually the horn of a narwhal, and was generally believed to detect poison. The thing was worth more than 10,000 pounds, and she would often drink from it, as it had the purported benefit of exploding if ever poison were to touch it. She also had a ring made out of a bezoar, which she waved over wine and waited to see if it boiled. Might sound a bit paranoid to our ears, but a queen can never be too careful.
Rule number 5. Hone your education. And when someone tries to mansplain your own policies to you, give him a sweet smile and show him exactly why well-read women are such dangerous creatures.
Being highly educated was one of the many qualifications most Elizabethans looked for in their monarch, and no one could accuse Elizabeth of lacking in that area. Lizzie was more educated than most of the upper-class noblemen in Europe, taught by the best private tutors, including the celebrated Cambridge humanist Roger Ascham, who taught his young charge everything from classics to moral philosophy. She proved to be an admirable student who particularly excelled at languages. She became fluent in Latin, Greek, French, Spanish, and Italian, with Ascham remarking,
"Her mind has no womanly weakness. Her perseverance is equal to that of a man, and her memory long keeps what it quickly picks up."
Elizabeth's gift for languages served her well in her diplomatic pursuits, but she also made good use of her lessons in rhetoric, utilizing them to assert her authority in an age in which women were encouraged not to speak. Because Elizabeth's position of power put her in direct contradiction with societal gender norms, she often had to defend herself, and she relied heavily on her impressive education to do so. In the 1600s, women weren't supposed to speak out in public or exist in political spaces like Parliament. And so Elizabeth had to find creative ways in which to overcome these restrictions while still asserting the fact she was a boss lady. As it turns out, she was very, very good at it. What, like it's hard? And in 1598, Elizabeth remarked,
"It was no marvel to teach a woman to talk. It were far harder to teach her to hold her tongue."
She used her speeches to fashion herself as the wife of England and the mother of her people, a clever way of using language to walk the line between fulfilling her feminine gender role while still asserting her masculine authority. In her first speech in Parliament, Elizabeth claimed,
"I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England, and that may suffice you. And do not upbraid me with miserable lack of children, for every one of you, and as many as are Englishmen, are children and kinsmen to me."
If she was already married to England, and the English people were her children, then getting married and having kids becomes kind of a non-issue, doesn't it? Unfortunately, the guys did not shut up about it, which eventually led to Elizabeth's infamous petticoat speech. This was a 1566 address in which she tore Parliament a new one after they accused her of not caring about England because she just refused to marry Archduke Charles of Austria. After defending herself as a good and just ruler dedicated to her country, she reiterated that she had been perfectly open to marriage for the sake of England. Thus, she insults a room full of men by reminding them that, technically, she didn't need a man for anything except reproduction. Would you guys like some ice for that sick burn? She then reminded them who actually had all the power.
I am your anointed queen. I will never be by violence constrained to do anything.
Before taking off her crown and saying,
I thank God I am indeed endowed with such qualities that if I were turned out of the realm in my petticoat, I were able to live in any place of Christendom.
By drawing Parliament's attention to her petticoat, Lizzie was highlighting the audacity of the men to question their queen on such an intimate subject as having children. In order to emphasize how inappropriate they were acting, she rhetorically undressed down to her petticoat and used her female body as a way to re-establish her power and authority. In William Cecil's report to the full House of Commons, written after the speech, he states that,
All the house was silent.
Because of course you are, fools. When she wasn't using her education to put Parliament firmly in their place, she was giving badass speeches on the battlefield. In the late 1580s, she found herself giving a rousing speech to troops at Tilbury, cementing her status as a brilliant orator with the Armada speech. At this point, war with Spain seemed inevitable, as King Philip was hell-bent on overthrowing the Protestant Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule over England. Elizabeth was not amused by Philip's aggressive grandstanding, and in 1587 she remarked,
That although she was a woman and her profession was to try to preserve peace with neighbouring princes, if they attacked her, they would find that in war she could be better than a man.
Unfortunately, Elizabeth's silver tongue did not sway Philip, and in 1588 he sent an armada across the sea to conquer England. Elizabeth responded by visiting the Tilbury camp to give a speech to the English troops gathered there. Surrounded by military men, Elizabeth stood up and said,
And therefore I am come amongst you, as you see, at this time, not for my recreation and disport, but being resolved in the midst and heat of the battle to live or die amongst you all, to lay down for my God and for my kingdom and for my people my honour and my blood, even in the dust. I know I have the body but of a weak and feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm, to which rather than any dishonour shall grow by me, I myself will take up arms. I myself will be your general, judge and rewarder of every one of your virtues in the field.
Elizabeth was an unmarried woman living in an age when women's bodies and minds were considered weaker than men's. Despite how out of place she must have seemed, Elizabeth's Tilbury speech was considered a resounding success. And then England's navy defeated the Spanish Armada. This double triumph was the high watermark of Lizzie's reign. The fact that she defeated the enemy, protected the homeland, and safeguarded Protestant values caused her popularity to skyrocket. Who says a strong and educated woman can't win the day?
Rule number 6. Be a woman and a man.
It was thought that all kings had two bodies, that of their natural mortal body and that of their supernatural immortal body politic, which allowed him to transcend his human limitations. In this sense, kings were not just men, they were God's vessel for ruling the country. In Elizabeth's case, this meant she was not just a woman, but was imbued with divine authority. Lizzie seized this concept to justify her ability to rule regardless of her sex. She often argued that while her natural, mortal body might be female, her body politic was most certainly male. We see this language at work in many of her speeches, including the Armada speech, where she actually referred to herself as a king rather than a queen. Let's take a closer look at Elizabeth's androgynous rhetoric, because while she regularly took on leadership roles and used male language to describe herself, she still existed in a female body and presented herself as such. She took great pride in wearing elaborate clothing and makeup and was celebrated for her virginal status and her role as wife and mother of England. But she also acted, in the public's eyes, like a man, in that she gave speeches, engaged in politics and warfare, and ruled the country. Lizzie essentially took on the roles of king and queen, and her subjects viewed her in that way. Indeed, Elizabeth was masterful at picking and choosing when to display masculine or feminine qualities to best advantage. For example, when addressing the House of Commons, she once said,
"The weight and greatness of this matter might cause in me, being woman, wanting both wit and memory, some fear to speak and bashfulness besides, a thing appropriate to my sex. But yet the princely seat and kingly throne wherein God, though unworthy, hath constituted me, maketh these two causes to seem little in mine eyes."
Here, Elizabeth brings up her natural feminine body only to assure her audience that it is of no great consequence, and is in fact superseded by her male body politic, which allows her to rise above her feminine limitations and deal with matters of state. It is also notable that whenever Elizabeth's counselors praised her, they tended to use masculine rather than feminine descriptions.
Queen Elizabeth, being a virgin of manly courage, professed that she was an absolute free princess to manage her actions by herself or her ministers.
When Elizabeth survived a poisoning attempt decades later, her supporters reported that she
remained undaunted with a manly spirit.
Okay. Elizabeth enjoyed these heavily gendered descriptions, and she actively leaned into the idea that she was both male and female, and she wore a doublet like a champ. So Elizabeth was powerful, independent, outspoken, assertive, and walking around calling herself the king. Does that mean she was a feminist? Not exactly. Just because Elizabeth lived contrary to society's norms of how women should behave doesn't mean she believed that every woman should do so. Like most people of her time, she believed that most women were biologically inferior to men. Of course, she didn't really count herself as being like most women. She lived her life as if she was the exception to the rule, without bothering to question whether or not the rule was accurate. So, despite the fact that Elizabeth was the most powerful person in England, we can't really say she used her power to help out other ladies. The second book of the Homilies, produced by Elizabeth's bishops, encouraged women to marry and obey their husbands, stating,
"The woman is a weak creature, not endued with like strength and constancy of mind."
In many ways, Elizabeth was a paradox. Highly educated, a brilliant orator, excellent at sports, and she spent her days talking politics and warfare. But she did not believe that all of her accomplishments proved that women were just as capable as men. She believed that she was the only woman capable of doing all of these things because she had been chosen by God. Rather than viewing Elizabeth as a feminist who defied social norms on the grounds of women's rights, it's probably more accurate to view her as an individualist with a bit of an ego problem. But then again, she is the product of Henry VIII. That doesn't mean her rule wasn't impressive and that it didn't prove a larger point. She was an intelligent and savvy politician who didn't need a man to rule effectively. And to this day, she is the only Queen of England who never married. As Sir Francis Bacon wrote, Elizabeth was ever her own mistress. And that's a wrap on Season 3. Thanks so much for time traveling with me back to Tudor England. We'll be back with Season 4 in February. See you then. Thanks for listening. The music you just enjoyed comes courtesy of John Sayles, who graciously offers his Tudor-era appropriate recreations absolutely free of charge. You'll find links to his work on my website, as well as transcripts, lists of my sources, images, and more. Just check out theexplorespodcast.com. I am so thankful to my patrons, and also to Carly Quinn, my writing and research assistant. I couldn't do it without you. Much love to Paul Gablonsky for my theme music and logo, and to the following for their vocal stylings: Susanna, who played Elizabeth I, and Ed, who played all of our Tudor gents.